Greetings and welcome to the last mini lecture on the history section. In the next mini lecture, I will start out by giving some overviews about the modern British political system, and there will be several mini lectures devoted to the various aspects of the modern political system, starting with some overviews and then getting into the monarch, the prime minister, the cabinet, the House of Commons and Lords, and then we will transition from the British institutional system to the British political system, where we'll talk about parties and interest groups and elections and all of that good stuff. So, in this last mini lecture, I want to talk about the rise of the welfare state, and I hinted at this at the end of the last mini lecture. Talked about how a new political party, the Labour Party, was really developed by 1900. That with the expansion of voting rights, especially that Third Reform Act, political parties, in order to be elected, really had to be responsive to the needs for welfare measures for middle class and then eventually even lower class voters. So public education, housing, jobs, medical care, etc. And the Labor Party, particularly after World War I, became a workers' trade union dominated party. And while the Labor Party isn't as dominated by trade unions today as it used to be, certainly that is the historical background to that party. Now, I mentioned at the end of the hour that this rise of mass politics changed the distribution of power between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The reason that the Parliament Act of 1911 was passed was, remember, the House of Commons wanted to pass this people's budget, as it was called, in 1909. The House of Lords thought that it was wasteful, too much money was being spent on public works, and so they rejected that budget. So in 1910, there was an election in Britain in which that was really the chief issue, and essentially the people supporting that budget won overwhelmingly. And when that happened, the Lords was still somewhat reluctant. But in this case, the king behind the scenes said, look, this needs to get passed. And so they did pass it in 1910. But the House of Commons was so upset, and we now had kind of a more militant group because the election created a much more liberal House of Commons, that they passed this act, which essentially stripped the House of Lords of their traditional veto over money bills. And it even stripped their ability to veto regular legislation. They were only allowed to delay legislation. So the expansion of suffrage, one of the casualties was the power of the House of Lords. And so we go from a meaningful bicameral legislature to one in which the House of Commons really is the dominant legislature. And so that was quite intriguing. I also found it intriguing that in that Parliament Act of 1911, the House of Commons reduced their own term of office. That's really remarkable, that instead of a 7-year term, it's now a maximum of a 5-year term, and even earlier if the prime minister calls for an election early, and I'll get into that later on. So not only did the Reform Acts gradually bring the people into politics, but it transformed the relationship between the House of Commons and House of Lords, and that really does not get, in my opinion, adequate coverage in your textbook. So I turn now to the last topic, and if you read Roskin at the end of that section, there's really almost no coverage other than the welfare state really is a direct result of the mass public now being in charge, that the House of Commons is democratized, and that the demands of the lower and middle classes are now being heard really for the first time. I would add something that I think is a big omission in this chapter, and that is that Roskin doesn't mention the impact of World War One. That World War One created a situation where the state took increasing control of a number of industries, including railways, mining, and shipping. The state actually monitored and set prices. The state restricted the flow of capital abroad to prevent a financial crisis. And the state took a much more active role in channeling resources really to a total war effort for the first time in quite some time. And certainly World War One is the first modern war. And by that I mean that in World War One we have uh, lower and middle class people who are drafted. They go and fight. A large number of people die. After that war, the mass public really wants to punish the Germans, who they think are responsible for World War One, although there's really a lot of people responsible for World War One in Europe. In World War Two, it's clearly Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. In World War One, it's a little murkier, but again, politics is about perception. And the perception that is generated in Britain, in the United States, in France, throughout uh, the the Allies, if you will, is that the Germans are responsible, and therefore they should lose their colonies. They should be hit with reparations, and they should be punished. And I'm going to talk later about how this really laid the groundwork for the rise of Nazi Germany in the Second World War. Now, after World War II, this is really interesting to me on a personal level, not just an academic level. There is an election in 1935 that brings the Conservative Party. In fact, I'll talk about the 1935 election in more detail later, but the 1935 election is interesting to me because it is the last time in British history that a political party gets a majority of the vote. It is the most sweeping political landslide in Britain, I think, ever, but certainly since 1900. So the Conservatives win this landslide. They have a prime minister in this case, Neville Chamberlain, Stanley Baldwin. They're the two dominant conservative figures of the 1930s. Both of them were prime ministers in the 1930s. Of course, World War II breaks out, and Neville Chamberlain, who had cancer and had a nervous breakdown, resigns, and Winston Churchill takes over. And there is not another election in Britain from 1935 until 1945. Imagine that happening in the United States. It would be impossible. The United States had an election in 1864, right in the middle of the U.S. Civil War. In fact, Abraham Lincoln told his cabinet secretaries early in 1864, you guys better start looking for another job because my prospects of winning aren't very good. And of course, in 1864, the war changed. With the capture of Atlanta in particular and Sherman's march to the sea, it was now apparent that the North was going to win the Civil War. But we even had an election during the Civil War. Britain did not have a general election for 10 years. And of course, Churchill is the great war hero, right? He is the one who steers Britain through World War II victoriously. And ironically, shortly after the war ends, there's a call for elections. The war's over, we're back to normal, so there's an election. And Winston Churchill loses. He loses the election to Clement Attlee in the Labour Party. And Clement Attlee runs as a socialist. We hear this word socialist all the time in America, and the people who are being accused of being socialist aren't really socialist at all. They're more like welfarists. I mean, Clement Attlee talks about nationalizing British Air, British Rail, coal, steel, trucking. I'll talk about this later when I talk about that this was one of the most important elections in Britain over the last 100 years. And so under Clement Attlee, the government takes a much more active role in regulating the economy. The Attlee government nationalizes several industries, everything from Rolls-Royce and Jaguar to, British Petroleum and steel and coal and a whole bunch of stuff. And in response to the devastation of the Depression, the Attlee government also creates a comprehensive national welfare state with the crown jewel, the cornerstone, being the creation of the National Health Service in 1948 as its cornerstone. And what's interesting is that the National Health Service actually had kind of a bipartisan consensus originally. Conservatives embraced the national healthcare system because during World War II, the Depression had been so devastating in Britain. When the Depression hit, that affected really the whole world, Great Britain had the greatest income and wealth inequality of any advanced democracy in the world. Today, that's the United States. But the Depression was so devastating in Britain that a lot of men who tried to volunteer for military service were deemed unfit for duty because of the effects of childhood malnutrition and disease. So the liberals in Britain were arguing for the National Health Service as a basic right, and conservatives were arguing for the national health system for national security and for national defense. And if you think that this is an aberration, in the United States, the first major interest group to speak on behalf of the childhood nutrition program in schools was the U.S. military, for many of the same reasons, so that children would be guaranteed a minimal level of nutrition. And so those children, when they grew up and were eligible for military service, those people would be fit for duty. Interesting. Sometimes these labels of, quote, liberal and conservative are much more complex than the talking heads on these talk shows and these TV networks would have you believe. We are now done with our background to British government. In the next mini lecture, we turn to what Roskin calls the key institutions, and we will be talking about modern British government and its political institutions. Have a good evening. Take care. Bye-bye. See you soon.